In the soft hills of Tuscany, in the spring of 1452, a child was born beneath a pale and quiet sky. The village of Vinci lay nestled between olive trees and sunlit stone, a place where the days moved gently and the seasons hummed in cycles older than memory. His name was Leonardo. He came into the world not with fanfare but with stillness, born to a young peasant woman named Caterina and a notary named Piero. They were not married. Their lives intersected briefly and then diverged, leaving the boy to be raised mostly by his father's family in Vinci. The hills held him in their arms. As a boy, Leonardo wandered narrow paths through grasses and stones, watching the way light played on the leaves, how birds twisted in flight, how water ran across rocks with a purpose all its own. He had no surname in the modern sense, just Da Vinci, meaning from Vinci. His identity, like his thoughts, was quietly tethered to place, but never confined by it. The household was mixed, with siblings from his father's later marriages and servants who tended to daily life. Yet, Leonardo often seemed apart, not alone, but deeply within himself. He watched, and he drew. He asked questions. He noticed things that others passed by. A curled fern, a flickering shadow, the movement of a lizard across warm stone. There was no formal school for him. He learned letters, perhaps some Latin, but mostly he learned by looking. He traced the flight of birds in the sky with his eyes. He sketched the branches of trees with charcoal and care. He listened to the silence of streams. The world around him became a living notebook, long before he held a pen to paper. His father, Piero, saw something in the boy's scribbles, some spark, some unusual touch, and chose not to suppress it. This would shape Leonardo's path more than any title or fortune. A father's quiet approval opened a door, and beyond it lay the heart of Florence. But that moment had not yet come. For now, the boy remained in Vinci, held close by the rhythm of earth and sky. Each day brought small discoveries: a bird's feather, a glint of mica in stone, the way dew gathered on the tips of grass at dawn. He was not yet an artist, not yet an inventor, not yet a name whispered through centuries. He was a boy in the hills, and the world was quietly opening to him. There were no great libraries in Vinci, no towering schools or famous scholars. But for Leonardo, the land itself was a teacher. He studied the tilt of sunflowers and the curve of riverbanks. He watched how insects moved their legs in sequence, how clouds swirled in silence above fields of wheat. At times, he would draw with a stick in the dirt or scratch lines into slate. He had no formal canvas, yet he was already observing with precision that would one day shape cities and stir empires. Inside the home, his stepmothers came and went. Piero married several times, and Leonardo gained half-siblings, each born into a life of clearer legitimacy, but none seemed to rival his quiet presence. He was not loud or demanding. He did not chase status. What he sought were the hidden mechanics of the world: why a leaf curls when it dries, how shadows change through the day, why some birds soar while others only glide. Often, he wandered alone, not out of sadness, but from a pull deeper than companionship. Trees fascinated him, the veins of their leaves, the way their limbs forked at angles that seemed both random and precise. Rocks, too, caught his eye. He noticed the layers in their faces, the fossils embedded within. Time, he sensed, left its footprints everywhere. He once followed a stream up into the hills, tracing it to its spring. There, he watched how the water emerged from stone, cool and clear, as if the earth itself breathed. That single day would stay with him always. Later in life, He would recall that stream when sketching irrigation systems, designing aqueducts, imagining the flow of blood through human veins. His family was not poor. His father, a respected notary, provided comfortably. But Leonardo's wealth came from elsewhere, from wonder. No one told him to study the muscles of a horse or the arc of a dragonfly's flight. No one assigned him the movement of clouds or the twisting of a vine. He assigned those studies to himself, day after day, simply because he wanted to know. There were moments, too, of tenderness. A hand on his shoulder, from a servant who'd watched him grow. A nod from his father after seeing a careful sketch. The occasional visit to Florence with its grand buildings and crowded squares stirred something in him. A longing for a world beyond hills and stone walls. But Vinci remained his foundation. Its air filled his lungs. Its fields cradled his first thoughts. And in the dust of its paths, he drew the first lines of a lifelong journey. As Leonardo neared adolescence, the circle of hills around Vinci began to feel smaller. His questions outgrew the quiet lanes. His drawings filled pages now, not just dirt or stone. His father, ever watchful, made a decision that would shape the boy's future. He would send him to Florence. Florence was not far in miles, but in mind, it was a different world entirely. A city pulsing with energy and art. A place where thinkers gathered, where color spilled from church walls, and where bronze, marble, and music shaped daily life. It was the heart of the Renaissance. Before he left, Leonardo likely walked the fields one last time. The olive trees would have swayed gently, the wind brushing past him like a whisper. He would have known the routes by heart, the rise of each hill, the coolness of shaded paths. There may have been a moment of hesitation, a quiet farewell to the land that raised him. In Florence, his father arranged for him to apprentice with a master, Andrea del Verrocchio. It was not an act of privilege, but of belief. Piero had seen enough in his son to offer him to one of the most respected workshops in the city. This was not common for children born outside of marriage, yet Leonardo had already begun to move beyond the boundaries of convention. The city opened before him like a vast manuscript. Towers rose above tiled rooftops. Markets buzzed with vendors and scholars alike. In the distance, the unfinished dome of Santa Maria del Fiore seemed to float above the city, a marvel of stone and sky. At Verrocchio's workshop, young Leonardo would soon be surrounded by tools and pigments, bronze casts and marble blocks. But he arrived first as a student, humble and curious. His past was one of nature and solitude. His future now was one of craft and transformation. Still, the hills of Vinci lived within him. In the curves of leaves he painted, in the way he studied anatomy, in the silence he often preferred. The village had not limited him. It had prepared him. In stillness, in detail, in it. Patience, ta-da. And so, he stepped into the world beyond his home. Not with loud ambition, but with deep attention. The boy from the Tuscan hills had taken his first quiet stride toward timelessness. Florence, in the late 1460s, shimmered with promise. Its streets were filled with the sounds of chisels on stone, voices debating in courtyards, and the hush of brushes sweeping pigment onto walls. Within these rhythms, Leonardo began his formal apprenticeship. Andrea del Verrocchio's workshop was more than a studio. It was a place of becoming. Here, young men shaped wood and bronze, mixed their own paints, and learned not only how to copy, but how to see. Verrocchio himself was sculptor, painter, goldsmith, and engineer. a man of many crafts, and thus an ideal mentor for one with such restless curiosity. Leonardo did not stand out at first. He learned quietly. He observed everything. Day after day he cleaned brushes, prepared panels, stirred plaster, and sanded wood. These early tasks were mundane to some, but not to him. Each stroke taught him something about surface. Each tool held a secret waiting to be discovered. In time, his talent began to emerge. His drawings showed a sensitivity to form. That was rare. He could sketch a face that felt alive. He captured gestures that breathed. His lines were light, but they held the weight of thought. Verrocchio noticed. So did others. The workshop took on commissions of all kinds: altarpieces, portraits, statues for chapels, designs for festivals. Leonardo contributed to these large projects, often anonymously. He painted small details, draped cloth, background figures, the shimmer on a silver plate. With each assignment, his hand grew more confident. In one piece, the Baptism of Christ, Leonardo is said to have painted an angel beside John. The difference is subtle but unmistakable. His angel looks upward with a softness Verrocchio had never achieved. It was said that the master put down his brush after seeing it, acknowledging the pupil had surpassed the teacher. But there was no rivalry between them. Leonardo admired Verrocchio, and Verrocchio respected the quiet boy who saw so deeply into things. Their bond was one of discipline and discovery, shaped not by ego but by craft. Outside the studio, Florence offered new awakenings. Leonardo wandered the city on foot, often alone, sketching buildings, faces, and animals. He observed people in markets, watched shadows shift across statues, traced the arches of the bridges, Dixie, Gafro, Pendred, Tinchers. He did not move quickly. He moved with care. The city's architecture fascinated him. How weight was held by stone. How light entered through narrow windows. How domes rose above squares like captured skies. Brunelleschi's great dome, still a marvel of engineering, stirred something inside him. Not envy, but hunger. He wanted to understand how things were built and how they lived. There were no formal sciences as we know them now, but Leonardo approached art with a scientific mind. He sketched gears and pulleys. He dissected birds to study their wings. He began to ask questions not just of beauty, but of motion and balance. Verrocchio encouraged this. The workshop did not restrain curiosity, it fed it. As Leonardo entered his 20s, he was no longer just a student. He had become a maker in his own right, his reputation beginning to drift gently through the city. Yet he was still learning, still watching, still letting the work speak louder than words. Florence had not changed him. It had revealed him. Beneath the stone arches and gilded chapels, the boy from Vinci was quietly becoming Leonardo. The air in Florence carried more than scent or sound. It carried thought. In the streets, in the cloisters, and in the homes of merchants and nobles, people spoke of perspective and proportion, of God and the body, of how to see the world and how to shape it. This was the soil in which the Renaissance bloomed, and Leonardo walked quietly through it, gathering fragments of wonder. He was not yet famous, but his name had begun to pass between patrons. Some knew him for his sketches, others for his early paintings. A few, more observant, noted how he always seemed to be drawing. Faces in profile, twisted ropes, storm clouds, a horse mid-step. Everything he saw was translated into lines. Within the studio, he now took on greater responsibility. He painted drapery studies for larger works, modeled figures in clay, experimented with new pigments. His fascination with the physical world deepened. A bowl of fruit was not just a still life. It was a study of color, of decay, of light hitting texture. Florence responded in kind. The city was a living gallery. Works by Botticelli and Ghirlandaio adorned churches. Sculptures by Donatello seemed to breathe in the piazzas. From the workshops came ideas, wrapped in marble and paint. Leonardo absorbed them all, not to imitate, but to refine. He began to take commissions on his own. One, a painting of the Madonna, revealed his growing subtlety, how a hand rested lightly on a knee, how the child leaned into the mother's touch. In another, he painted a portrait so delicately that the sitter seemed to exhale. These early pieces were not grand, but they were full of quiet power. But Leonardo's interests were never still. While others focused on brush and chisel, he returned again and again to his notebooks. He drew machines, gears, lifts, and cranes. He studied knots and the branching of trees. He examined how water swirled in a basin and how shadows pooled in corners. No topic was beneath his attention, no phenomenon too small. He listened to. In Florence, ideas flowed like rivers. Conversations with architects, mathematicians, and physicians left their mark. He did not debate publicly. He did not write treatises. He simply watched, read, and remembered. Some said he was slow to finish things, and they were not wrong. Many of his paintings from this time remain incomplete or lost entirely, but the slowness came from depth, not hesitation. He worked until the vision was clear, and if it was never clear, he set it aside. In evenings, he often walked along the Arno River. The water moved gently between stone embankments, reflecting lanterns and stars. He would pause at bridges and trace their curves. Somewhere between the river and the sky, he imagined new forms, flying machines, floating cities, theaters of mirrors and light. This was Florence in its flowering. And Leonardo, though still young, had become one of its quiet architects. Not with buildings or decrees, but with pages and paint, each mark a step closer to understanding. He was not finished becoming, but the shape of his mind was already visible, like a sculpture just beneath the surface of stone. The time came when Leonardo stood ready to work, not as an apprentice, but as an artist in his own name. Verrocchio had taught him all he could. The city itself had been his second tutor. Now, the path forward belonged to him alone. He took on commissions more freely, though his pace remained thoughtful. One of the most promising was an altarpiece, the Adoration of the Magi. The scene was grand, filled with twisting figures, crumbling architecture, and the slow hush of something divine arriving in the world. Leonardo began it with great care, sketching dozens of studies for faces, horses, trees, and gestures. But the painting was never finished. Like so many of his works, it reached a point where the idea outgrew the medium. What remains is a haunting image in shades of brown and gold, a forest of unfinished figures leaning toward a calm and distant child. Even incomplete, it speaks with clarity. The movement, the emotion, the gaze, they live. Leonardo was not known for speed. Patrons often waited longer than expected. But when the work did arrive, it was unlike anything they'd seen. He used light, as others used shape. He softened lines into atmosphere. His figures didn't pose. They existed. They looked at one another. They breathed. His notebooks during this time were filled with the same energy. He drew a mechanical knight that could move. He studied the flow of blood through the heart. He began to understand proportion not as a rule, but as a rhythm. To Leonardo, the body and the world shared a harmony, visible if one only looked closely enough. Florence admired him, but he did not quite belong to its crowd. He lacked the flair of some painters, the self-promotion of others. He did not join debates in the square. He did not marry or seek titles. He lived simply, keeping his thoughts in leather-bound books, his sketches stacked on tables near the window. There were murmurs of a new opportunity beyond the city. In Milan, a powerful duke was seeking artists and engineers to serve his court, a place of patronage, invention, and pageantry. Florence had been Leonardo's garden, but Milan might become his workshop. And so, quietly, he began to prepare for departure. Not out of frustration, but from that same quiet curiosity that had moved him since boyhood. He had drawn the patterns of trees. He had painted the softness of a mother's gaze. He had watched water flow through stone canals. Now, he was ready to build, to design, to dream even more freely. Florence had given him tools. It had awakened his hand, his eye, and his heart. Now, it was time to see what else the world might offer. Leonardo arrived in Milan not as a celebrated painter, but as something more unusual, a man who offered music, architecture, weapons design, and the promise of spectacle. In a carefully written letter to Duke Ludovico, Sforza, he listed his talents like an artisan cataloging his tools. He barely mentioned painting. The Duke was intrigued. Milan, though rich in military and civic ambition, lacked the artistic energy of Florence. Leonardo was invited into court life not to hang portraits, but to create wonders, to engineer machines, to plan festivals, to dazzle with ideas. He brought with him a new set of notebooks. Each page became a world. Gears turned across the margins. Flying machines stretched their wings. Water wheels, pulleys, and siege engines filled line after line. Many of these were never built, but the act of drawing them brought Leonardo closer to understanding motion, balance, and the edge where science meets dream. He did not limit himself to invention. He studied proportion with renewed depth, using the human body as a map of symmetry. His famous sketch of the Vitruvian Man was born in this period. A figure of harmony, arms and legs outstretched, inscribed in circle and square. It was not just anatomy. It was philosophy in lines. His mind moved restlessly between ideas. One day he might dissect a bird to study flight. The next, he would diagram a crossbow or sketch a stage set. For courtly theater, there was no single pursuit. For Leonardo, understanding was a continuous thread pulled gently through every aspect of life. He also kept studying nature. In Milan's quieter gardens and courtyards, he observed how vines twisted toward the sun, how water crept along stone, how light shifted through tree canopies. These were not idle musings. To Leonardo, every observation had meaning. Every shadow had weight. Though he had left Florence behind, its lessons lived within him. He now saw Milan as a place to expand, not just his skills, but his reach. The court gave him resources. The Duke gave him space. And Leonardo filled both with ideas. He had not yet painted his most famous works. He had not yet sculpted his great horse. But the foundation was here, written across hundreds of pages in ink that has long since faded but never disappeared. These notebooks, private, precise, and endlessly inventive, became the truest mirror of his mind. They were where his brush met blueprint, where imagination took shape, where thought became art, and art became something far more than image. They were not for show. They were not for praise. They were for him. And in them, Leonardo was beginning to build a world no one else had ever quite seen. Though he arrived in Milan with promises of engineering and spectacle, it was Leonardo's art that slowly began to make itself known. The Duke may have first employed him for military plans and theatrical designs, but soon brush met pigment, and pigment gave way to quiet revelation. He took his time with portraits. His subjects were not flattened symbols of wealth or power. They were people, seen as if in a fleeting moment. A turn of the head, a lift in the brow, a half-smile that hinted at a thought just forming. These details mattered more than ornament or status. One of his first Milanese portraits was of Cecilia Gallerani, a young woman at court. She is shown holding a white ermine, its paws resting delicately in her arm. The painting, now known as Lady with an Ermine, glows with life. Her gaze is not fixed on the viewer, but turned to the side, alive with thought. The animal is not mere decoration. It adds rhythm, meaning, and grace. Leonardo studied the human face as if it were a landscape. He watched how laughter changed the muscles near the eyes, how sorrow touched the lips without a word. He carried these insights into every canvas. Each portrait, a quiet dialogue between artist and soul. But he did more than paint. He experimented constantly, mixing pigments, altering brushes, preparing new surfaces. He tested how oils dried, how light refracted through glazes. His art was not repetition. It was inquiry. No painting was ever routine. Even in commissioned works, he could not resist adjusting, refining, reconsidering. Some patrons grew impatient. Yet those who waited found themselves captured, not in still images, but in living echoes, portraits that seemed to breathe centuries after they were made. He also continued sketching constantly. Muscles, limbs, flowing hair, studies of laughter and grief. He filled pages with ideas for larger paintings, some that never left paper. Among these were designs for grand biblical scenes, architectural backdrops, and mechanical details worked into robes and scenery. In these years, his gaze grew sharper. He no longer painted merely to fulfill a task. He painted to see. And in doing so, he changed the act of painting itself. The human form was no longer a symbol of beauty or power. It was an expression of movement, of balance, of inner life. Eyes met. The viewer with mystery, hands curled with thought. Faces lived between emotion and stillness. It's easy to forget how new this was. But in Leonardo's time, such realism was rare. His ability to observe, to wait, to shape a moment with care, set him apart not only as a painter, but as a student of life. Brush in hand, he found truths that no theory could explain. And in each portrait, he captured not only likeness, but presence. An unseen thread that runs from canvas to soul, and from his world into ours. Even as his reputation in Milan grew, Leonardo remained, as always, a figure in motion. Not outwardly, he stayed in the city, fulfilled duties, accepted praise. But inwardly he was drifting again, towards something larger, towards something he could never quite name. He had been promised a grand project, a towering bronze horse, a monument to Francesco Sforza, the Duke's father. It would be the largest equestrian statue the world had seen. Leonardo accepted eagerly, not only because of the honor, but because it united so many of his passions: anatomy, engineering, and grace in motion. He studied horses obsessively. He sketched their muscles in motion, their hooves mid-trot, their heads alert or bowed. He visited stables and watched them for hours, seeing in them both strength and serenity. He built models, calculated weights, imagined how bronze might be poured and cooled at such scale. And yet, the statue was never cast. While crept toward Milan. Bronze, once reserved for beauty, was now needed for cannons. The project was delayed, then forgotten. The models were stored, then lost. And the great horse, so present in Leonardo's mind, would remain only as sketches and dreams. It was not the first time, nor would it be the last, that a vision outpaced its time. Still, he continued to work. He painted religious scenes, designed complex stage effects for court festivities, and drafted plans for canals and defense systems. He dissected animals to study tendons and sinew, trying to understand how life held itself together. His notebooks in this period deepened. They became more crowded, more urgent. Pages overflowed with tiny script written in mirrored loops. Diagrams filled every space. Water flow, gear tension, muscle movement, the angle of light through a window, each entry a doorway into understanding. He often worked late into the night, by candlelight, the room around him still. Ideas came. Faster than he could contain them. He began more than ever to leave projects incomplete. Not from carelessness, but from the overwhelming flood of vision. One painting gave way to a machine. One sketch became a question. One idea opened into 5 more. Those who knew him described him as kind, well-mannered, occasionally distracted. He spoke softly, dressed with care, enjoyed music and good company. Yet always, part of him remained elsewhere, in diagrams and pigments, in thought and in silence. The Duke's fortunes began to dim. Politics shifted. Invasions loomed. Milan, once a haven for Leonardo's ambitions, now felt less certain. He did not leave in haste. He waited, as he often did, until the moment felt right. Then, quietly, with only his notebooks and a few companions, he stepped away. The great horse had not been cast. The war machines had not been built. But in his pages, and in his gaze, a foundation had been laid. A new chapter awaited him beyond Milan. And once again he would go, not in triumph or retreat, but in search. When Leonardo first arrived in Milan, the city was a canvas of ambition. Towers reached toward the sky, and noble families whispered in palaces of power, legacy, and art. It was not the quiet Florence he had known. Milan breathed in colder tones, more courtly, more ceremonial, more bound to spectacle. Ludovico Sforza, called Il Moro, was not yet duke in name, but he controlled the city's levers of power. He surrounded himself with thinkers, musicians, and strategists, each meant to project the grandeur of his court. Leonardo, with his long tunic, his calm demeanor, and his startling ideas, fit oddly yet perfectly into this world. He was not summoned as a painter. His letter to Ludovico had promised fortresses, bridges, siege devices, and innovative weaponry. And Leonardo did design them. Machines for lifting, for destroying, for defense and diversion. Some looked like beetles of wood and steel, others like wings stretched taut over frames. But his genius was never confined to function. Even his war machines bore elegance, a kind of poetry within their gears. The court was intrigued. They saw in Leonardo not only a craftsman, but a thinker unlike any they had known. Soon, his role expanded. He designed elaborate festivals, where myth and music mingled under painted skies. He planned theatrical sets that turned with hidden wheels and concealed pulleys. He arranged costumes, choreography, even lighting. A single evening's spectacle might take months of thought. The Duke was pleased. For him, art was power. Beauty, when displayed with precision, reinforced control. Leonardo understood this, but he never bowed to it. His work was shaped by wonder, not flattery. He delivered what was asked, but always on his terms. And then came the commissions for painting. Portraits, altarpieces, decorative panels. Leonardo approached each slowly, meticulously, unwilling to repeat the gestures of others. He painted not to decorate walls, but to uncover meaning. His subjects did not pose. They paused. They did not smile. They breathed. Around him the court pulsed with intrigue and ceremony. But Leonardo remained apart. He observed, he listened, and in his own chambers he drew. Machines, knots, flowing hair, anatomical studies. His pages multiplied. He began to study the human body with deeper purpose. Muscles, joints, how an arm lifted, how a hand curled in sleep. He noted each movement with care, not only for painting, but because he believed truth lived in structure. A body was not only form, it was design, proportion, energy. In Milan, he found not only a patron, but a platform. The court gave him resources. The duke gave him license. And within those boundaries, Leonardo explored the edges of what art could become. But court life was never still. Alliances shifted. War loomed like a slow shadow. Yet for now, Leonardo remained in favor, his ideas feeding pageants, machines, and portraits alike. And behind every assignment, another notebook filled. Lines building upon lines, dreams stacking softly into legacy. In a quiet dining hall within the convent of Santa Maria della Grazia, Leonardo was asked to paint a familiar scene, the final meal of Christ with his disciples. It was a subject rendered many times before, each version echoing the last. But Leonardo did not copy. He reimagined. He studied the Gospels carefully, not just the words, but the pauses between them. He asked, what moment speaks loudest, not in volume, but in meaning? He chose the instant after Christ reveals that one among them will betray him. A hush, a ripple, the moment when truth enters a room and changes its shape. Each disciple responds in their own way. Shock, confusion, defensiveness, sadness. Hands reach out, eyes turn, bodies shift, caught between motion and stillness. Leonardo sketched for months. He studied human expressions in the streets and drew hands. For days at a time. He tested arrangements, grouping the 12 in threes, their emotions unfolding like a wave across the table. At the center, Christ sat calm, a still point in the storm. But the wall he painted on was not true fresco. Leonardo, always experimenting, used a technique involving tempera and oil on dry plaster, seeking more detail, more subtlety. The result was luminous, but fragile. Even as he worked, the surface began to rebel. He painted slowly, sometimes staring at the wall for hours without lifting his brush. Other times he painted in bursts, climbing scaffolds with sudden intensity. Monks whispered of his strange hours, of his quiet presence, of the way he seemed to listen more than speak. And when it was done, the Last Supper was unlike any painting the city had seen. It was not a sacred icon. It was a living moment. The room in the painting seemed to extend the real dining hall, blurring the boundary between wall and world. The light fell with natural grace. The gestures were human, immediate. No golden halos, no rigid forms. Only a table, 13 men, and the hush of revelation. People came in silence to look. Some wept. Others stared. Word of the painting spread far beyond Milan, reaching Florence, Rome, even the distant courts of Europe. And yet, from the start, it began to fade. The wall absorbed moisture. The paint flaked. The surface cracked. Leonardo, aware of its decay, returned often to touch up areas, though even he could not stop time. But the image endured. In sketches, in memory, in echoes that artists carried into their own work. He had not painted a scene. He had captured a pulse of human truth. A single second, stretched across centuries. And in that quiet room, surrounded by walls of stone and whispering monks, Leonardo had placed his name gently into history. As the years passed in Milan, Leonardo continued to fill notebooks with thoughts that wandered well beyond his commissions. He remained at court, still in favor, still a quiet presence in the shadows of ceremonies and banquets. Yet his mind moved elsewhere, toward the body, toward motion, toward hidden workings beneath the surface of all things. Anatomy became a deeper obsession. He sought permission to dissect human cadavers, and when granted, worked by candlelight through long nights, recording muscle structures, veins, organs. He traced the path of nerves from spine to fingertip. He drew the chambers of the heart with stunning accuracy, far ahead of his time. To Leonardo, the body was not a mystery to fear. It was a miracle to understand. And so he studied, not with detachment but with reverence. His drawings were not cold. They breathed. They lived on paper as bodies once lived in the world. At the same time, he began to lose himself in engineering. He envisioned bridges, canals, and military defenses. His machines became more intricate. He built models for rotating cranes, gear-driven carts, and hydraulic systems. Some were practical. Others, like a mechanical lion that could walk and open its chest to present flowers, were marvels meant to delight and mystify. But behind the beauty lay burden. Many of his projects remained unfinished. Some lacked funding. Others were too advanced, too delicate, or too visionary for their time. He was praised for his mind, but often left with little to show. The bronze horse statue, once promised to the Duke, remained a model in clay. Bar took priority, and the metal was needed for cannons. Leonardo did not rage. He rarely showed frustration, but he began to step back. Took longer walks, spent more time alone. He studied how birds fold their wings mid-flight, how water spirals into whirlpools, how clouds gather and scatter across the sky. He painted less, though not from lack of inspiration. His standards had risen too high. Each brushstroke had to match the vision in his mind, and that vision was always growing. His reputation, however, held firm. Visitors to Milan sought him out. They came not only to see his works, but to speak with him. They described him as thoughtful, gracious, always observing. The Duke remained his patron, but their bond was quiet now. Leonardo had become less a servant of courtly display, and more a philosopher with ink-stained fingers. He still attended events, offered advice, played music when asked. But most of his energy flowed inward, into the spiral of questions that never ceased. Then came news of war. French forces advanced on Milan. The city's balance teetered. The Duke fell from power. The court dissolved. And once again, Leonardo found himself on the edge of change. He gathered what he could, notes, sketches, instruments, and prepared to leave. He did not flee. He drifted away, as he always did, not out of fear, but with quiet resolve. The years in Milan had shaped him deeply. They had given him space, tools, canvas, and time. Now that space was gone. But the journey, as always, was not ending. It was only turning. Before he left Milan behind, Leonardo turned once more to the project that had haunted his years there. The great horse. It had begun with such promise. A commission from Ludovico Sforza, meant to honor his father in a statue unlike any the world had seen. Larger than any Roman bronze. A horse not merely to be seen, but to be remembered. Leonardo threw himself into the task. He studied anatomy as if preparing for battle. He sketched hooves from every angle, mapped the curvature of muscle along a horse's back, watched animals walk and turn and rise on hind legs. He did not want to sculpt a symbol. He wanted to sculpt life itself. He built small models first, studies in wax and clay, then a full-scale clay version, towering and proud. It stood in an open courtyard, visible to those who passed. A promise cast in earth, waiting to become bronze. But bronze never came. I drew closer. The Duke faced threats from France Doyle. The city turned inward, and the metal once reserved for art was melted down for cannons. The horse stood for a time, uncast, exposed to wind and rain. Eventually, it was destroyed, targeted by invaders, crumbling in neglect. Leonardo said little. He rarely complained, even in failure. But in his notebooks, the drawings of horses continued. Quietly, persistently. He never let them go. To him, the statue was not just a monument. It was a convergence of beauty, of physics, of will. Its loss was more than artistic. It was the erasure of a question not yet answered. Still, he moved forward. He traveled briefly to Mantua, then Venice, always with sketches under his arm. He showed his models to noblemen. Some admired, some promised support, but none matched the scale of what Milan had offered. In Venice, he advised on military defenses, designed canals, but studied how water moved through narrow spaces. The city, floating and fragile, fascinated him. But his stay was short. The winds of war shifted again. And so, with little ceremony, he returned to Florence. The city of his youth welcomed him back. Though he was no longer the quiet apprentice, he returned with pages filled by a life of observation and the quiet weight of things undone. The great horse was lost, but its spirit remained. In every line of muscle, in every note on balance and form. Leonardo had poured a part of himself into clay. And even as the statue vanished, the vision behind it endured. Back in Florence, Leonardo carried with him not only notebooks and memories, but questions. Always questions. And now, with fewer commissions and more solitude, he turned inward once more, into the study of the human form. Anatomy, for Leonardo, was not a passing interest. It was a language. Each muscle told a story. Each joint held logic. The human body was a cathedral of design, more intricate than any sculpture or painting. He gained access to hospitals and morgues. Often working at night, he dissected in silence, sketching as he worked. He studied the layering of muscle over bone, the pathways of veins, the coiling of the intestines, the chambers of the heart. His drawings from this time are extraordinary. Not only precise, but tender. They are not cold diagrams. They are portraits of flesh, of structure, of the mystery of life seen from the inside. He invented ways to show transparency, cutting away layers like pages in a book. He even explored how the body moved, How a leg walked, how the jaw opened, how the eye turned in its socket. His studies were not shared. They lived in his notebooks, written in mirror script, turned inward as though for safekeeping. There was no audience, no applause, only pursuit. But it was not the body alone that drew him in. He studied proportion and motion. He watched old men walk and young children climb. He tried to understand not only how we are built, but how we move through space, how balance is kept, how gestures are made. He returned often to the image of the Vitruvian man. Arms stretched wide, feet apart, held inside the geometry of a circle and a square. It was not just art. It was a map of what it means to be human, drawn with reverence and clarity. These anatomical explorations spilled into his other work. He redesigned tools, experimenting with leverage and pressure. He wrote about the mechanics of breathing, the rhythm of walking, the spiral of hair. Even the smallest observations found their place. Florence offered inspiration, but it was in his solitude that Leonardo truly thrived. He wrote of the heart not as a pump, but as a masterwork of nature. Its valves, he believed, shaped by the flow of blood itself. He described how the lungs filled with air, how sound passed through the throat, how the skull cradled the brain like a nest. All of this centuries ahead of medical science. And yet, few ever saw these works in his lifetime. They were kept close, sketched by candlelight, recorded in careful hand. To Leonardo, understanding the body was not separate from art. It was its root. To paint a hand, one must know how it bends. To draw a face, one must see the muscles behind the smile. Anatomy was not only science, it was empathy. And in those quiet Florentine rooms, surrounded by sketches and silence, Leonardo searched for the pattern behind the pulse, for the design that lives beneath skin and soul alike. As he moved through middle age, Leonardo's fascination with flight took deeper root. It had begun in his youth, watching birds wheel above the Tuscan hills. But now, it became something more. Not a dream, but a problem to solve. He watched birds with the same intensity he once gave to anatomy. He studied how wings curved, how feathers flexed in air, how lift was gained not by flapping alone, but by shape and motion. He climbed hills to release wooden models, noting how they drifted and fell. And in his notebooks, flying machines took form. Some resembled bats, others birds, all powered by the turning of human limbs. He diagrammed gears and pulleys, wings that folded and extended. One design, known later as the ornithopter, had long wooden wings that beat like those of a great moth. He knew these machines would not yet fly. Human strength could not rival a bird's efficiency. But that didn't matter. Each drawing was a step forward. Each test a note in the symphony of discovery. He wrote about air as a substance that could be cut, about the pressure beneath wings, about balance and resistance. These were not poetic musings. They were the early stirrings of aerodynamics. Still, no machine took to the sky. Leonardo was not disheartened. For him, the act of imagining was itself flight. Even grounded, his thoughts soared. Flight was only one thread in a growing tapestry. He also turned his mind to water, how it flowed, turned wheels, how it carved valleys and lifted ships. He designed floating shoes, paddle boats, even a diving suit. His sketches show underwater breathing systems, long before such things were plausible. He was not inventing for fame. He rarely built what he designed. He was tracing the laws beneath nature, following currents most could not see. Back in Florence, his role remained fluid. He took few commissions, He appeared at gatherings but left early. He shared observations with a small circle of thinkers and students. But mostly, he worked alone. In quiet rooms, gears turned in thought. He wrote of how light moved through air, how sound echoed in domes, how heat rose in spirals. Each idea formed a link in a vast, invisible chain. And always, the birds returned. He studied their wings, their tails, their takeoffs and landings. His pages filled with arcs and angles, feathers drawn in layered precision. In one notebook, he wrote, "Once you have tasted flight, you will forever walk the earth with your eyes turned skyward." Perhaps he knew he would never fly. Perhaps he didn't need to. He had already done so in mind and line, again and again, with ink as his, wind and paper as his sky. The fall of Milan came quietly, but surely. French troops entered the city, and with them, the collapse of the court Leonardo had served for nearly 2 decades. Ludovico Sforza, once the patron of pageants and plans, was taken prisoner. The world Leonardo had built around sketches and commissions faded. He did not resist. He gathered his belongings, his notebooks, his instruments, and a few treasured models, and slipped away. He traveled first to Mantua, a smaller court with its own rhythm. There, he painted briefly and observed quietly. His time was short, but the city welcomed him. He left behind a few sketches, a portrait, and little else. He was already moving on. Next came Venice. The canals shimmered beneath him, the city floating on quiet water. He advised the Senate on defenses, plans for barriers to protect against invaders by sea. His mind, once filled with birds and flight, now sketched fortresses and floodgates. But he did not linger. Venice was beautiful, alive with sound and light. But Leonardo needed stillness, and so he returned to Florence once more. This time, he was no apprentice. He arrived not as a student, but as a master. Though, one still wrapped in solitude. The city had changed, and so had he. Faces from his youth had aged. Rivals had grown louder. But Leonardo, now in his 50s, walked through the streets without hurry. He watched, he listened, and he returned to his work. Commissions came again, some grand, others more intimate. He accepted them, though always on his terms. His pace remained slow, his standards unyielding. For some patrons, this brought frustration. For others, it brought wonder. He painted in small rooms, his tools arranged neatly, his notebooks open beside him. Assistants came and went. He spoke little while working, his focus always just ahead of the brush. Yet, even now, he moved often. He stayed briefly in different Florentine homes, accepted invitations, then drifted on. The war had left its mark, not in bitterness, but in a restlessness that never quite left. Each new place became a temporary nest. He observed the people of Florence, the merchants, the laborers, the travelers who passed through the markets. He watched how they stood, how they leaned into conversation, how they carried their stories in the lines of their faces. He was, in many ways, a guest in his own homeland. But he did not seek belonging. He sought understanding. The fall of Milan had taken away his court, but it had given him something else, a quiet freedom. And within that freedom, his wandering mind began to settle once more. Into paint, into sketches, into the slow pursuit of light and form. Amid the shifting paths of his later Florentine years, Leonardo accepted a quiet commission, a portrait of a woman, the wife of a Florentine merchant. Her name was Lisa. The painting would never be delivered. It would remain with Leonardo for years, carried across cities, kept close, touched and retouched, until it became not just a likeness, but a lingering moment that has outlived centuries. We know it as the Mona Lisa. He approached the painting slowly. As always, he began with sketches, studies of hands, folds of cloth, faint outlines of a smile. He worked with care, building layers of oil paint so thin they seemed to float. He softened every edge. He blurred every boundary. Her features emerged like breath upon glass. And then, the expression, that subtle smile, not quite happiness, not quite knowing. A smile that shifts as the light does. A smile that holds back more than it reveals. To Leonardo, portraiture was not decoration. It was revelation. The human face held depths no brush could fully capture. But he tried. He watched her eyes, how they turned just slightly away. He followed the curve of her mouth, the stillness of her pose. Behind her, a landscape, winding rivers, distant mountains, a sky that seems both calm and uncertain. Nature receding, as if drawn by memory. He worked on the painting for years. He never declared it finished. No one is quite sure why he kept it. Perhaps he intended to deliver it and changed his mind. Perhaps it became more than a commission, an exploration, an idea too delicate to release. The painting traveled with him from Florence to Rome, and eventually to France. It remained his companion, a window into everything he sought in art. Grace, mystery, and a sense of motion within stillness. Others painted with more speed, more drama, more grandeur. But Leonardo gave his subjects silence. He gave them breath. The Mona Lisa did not make him wealthy. It did not bring him royal titles. But it became, over time, the quiet symbol of his legacy. He captured not just a woman's face. He captured time as it pauses. And, in doing so, he offered us a question, not an answer. One that still waits, quietly, behind that smile. In these years of drifting between cities and commissions, Leonardo turned once again to his notebooks. They became his refuge, a place where thoughts moved freely, unbound by expectation or deadline. While others painted to please, he observed to understand. He studied optics, the way light entered the eye, how it bent through glass, how shadows curved across uneven surfaces. He drew diagrams of light rays crossing, bouncing, narrowing into focus. He explored reflection, refraction, and the fading of color with distance. He did not study these things in isolation. Light to him was a painter's breath. It gave volume to a cheek, depth to a fold of cloth, emotion to a room. By understanding light, he understood how to suggest warmth, sorrow, thought. He also returned to water, its flow, its weight, its strange ability to carve stone with time. He sketched eddies and ripples, waterfalls and floodgates. He compared the movement of water to blood, the swirl of currents to the turning of hair in wind. Everything in motion fascinated him, and everything to Leonardo was in motion. He studied trees, mapping how branches split and narrowed, how leaves followed patterns of growth. He saw math in every petal, proportion in every trunk. These were not distractions from his art. They were its core. Even shadows became subjects. He mapped how darkness fell on different shapes, how one light source differed from two. He experimented with how to paint the absence of light, how to suggest form not by line, but by the space it leaves behind. He kept all of this to himself. His notebooks grew thicker, filled with tiny mirrored script and hundreds of drawings. They were not meant for fame. They were conversations with the world, quiet and patient. He was often asked to return to painting to complete works he had left in states of near finish. But the call of inquiry was louder than the call of canvas. He did not reject art. He simply followed it into new places. Science and imagination in him were not separate pursuits. They were partners. Each fed the other. Each made the other whole. At a time when most saw the world through doctrine, Leonardo saw it through observation. He looked not for dogma, but for detail. What the eye sees before the mind begins to explain. In all of this, he was not a scientist in the modern sense. He conducted no experiments in laboratories. He published no findings. He built no schools. And yet, he saw farther. He wrote of the heart, the brain, the stars. He imagined machines that would not exist for centuries. He drew whirlpools and wings with the same care he gave to a face or a smile. Sorry. All, and always, there were shadows. Not as darkness, but as contrast, as depth, as the space where light begins. Leonardo arrived in Rome in his early 60s, at the invitation of the Medici. It was a city steeped in grandeur and history, but also brimming with ambition. Michelangelo was there, carving visions in marble. Raphael, too, was painting his serene frescoes in the Vatican's halls. Rome had become the new stage of the Renaissance. But for Leonardo, it felt less like arrival and more like exile. He was given rooms in the Belvedere wing of the Vatican. They were comfortable and quiet, and from his window he could see gardens and sky. Yet, despite the setting, something in the city left him untouched. There was admiration, yes, but little engagement. Younger artists were now at the forefront. Michelangelo, fierce and unyielding, worked with feverish energy. Raphael charmed patrons and priests alike. Leonardo, older and more inward, remained apart. He had no large commissions, no walls to fill, no cathedrals waiting for his vision. And so, as the city bustled around him, he did what he always had, he observed. He wandered the Vatican gardens, studying plants, insects, the way light gathered on leaves at dusk. He made notes on geology, sketched the flow of rivers in the surrounding hills. He watched how people moved through the city, how their robes fell, how their expressions shifted in conversation. Rome did not silence him, but it did not see him clearly either. He wrote few letters, entertained few visitors. His companions were his pupils, most notably Francesco Melzi, a young nobleman who had become both student and friend. Melzi cared for Leonardo's works, helped organize his notes, and walked with him through Rome's quieter streets. Among the ruins, Leonardo found echoes, not of his past, but of time itself. The crumbled arches, the worn stones, the fragments of statues once whole, all of it whispered that even great things fade, even brilliance gives way to dust. Still, he sketched, he designed, he wrote. He began studies of geometry and the movement of fluids. He experimented with mixing wax and pigment, trying once more to push the boundaries of what art could be. But the fire of patronage had cooled. Rome admired his legacy, but it did not know what to do with his presence. And so he stayed, quietly, drawing spirals in the margins of time. In the stillness of his Vatican quarters, Leonardo's days followed a quiet rhythm. He rose early, often before the city stirred, and filled his hours with drawing. Not with grand projects or royal requests, but with questions. He sketched the heart, again and again, its chambers, its valves, the movement of blood imagined like the flow of water through locks. He studied the spiral of arteries, the soft pulsing of vessels. To him, the body was not simply a vessel. It was a landscape, carved by time and function. No one in Rome asked him to do these things. There was no commission, no patron leaning over his shoulder. And perhaps that was why he worked so freely. In the silence, he returned to the things he had always loved, not for fame, but for clarity. He drew a fetus curled in the womb, surrounded by gentle lines and careful measurements. He compared this mystery to seeds, to shells, to the spiral in a snail's shell. Life, he believed, echoed itself in forms great and small. He also recorded mechanical ideas, devices for lifting, for measuring, for channeling water. He imagined a machine to test the tensile strength of metal. He studied how air moved through pipes, how sound traveled across distances. Some of these ideas had surfaced years before. But here, in Rome, they returned in quieter, more refined ways. Not as inventions to build, but as thoughts to preserve. His notebooks thickened. Each page held the same compact, mirrored script. Lines crossed over lines, sketches nested like birds in margins. They were private conversations, between him and the world, between past and possibility. He had once been a court favorite, a creator of spectacles. Be true, and day, and this, key. A master of portraits and celebration. Now, he was a quiet elder, watching from the edges. But his mind had not dimmed. It had only turned inward. In these Roman years, he left behind few paintings. But he left behind volumes of observation, hundreds of pages that would not be read for centuries. Inside them were ideas that would echo through medicine, engineering, art. He did not expect recognition. He expected only that the questions remain. And in his silence, the drawings kept speaking. They spoke of breath and light and movement. They spoke of how the world might be seen, not with grandeur, but with wonder. Leonardo's final months in Rome were spent at the far edge of activity. He no longer sought commissions, no longer sketched for patrons or prepared public displays. He lived as a quiet observer among monuments to ambition, surrounded by the works of others, many younger and more favored. Yet his notebooks from this time do not grow darker. They deepen. He turned again to geometry, revisiting ideas about the circle and the square, the golden ratio, the proportions that echo through nature. He traced spirals of shells, of galaxies, of whirlpools. He seemed to seek not perfection, but the rhythm beneath chaos. The universe to him was not a puzzle to solve. It was a structure to feel, measured, yes, but also alive. He did not draw to tame it. He drew to meet it. Line 4. Line doi. He wrote about the movement of planets, the shifting of winds, the play of light on moving water. His thoughts crossed disciplines, never settling, always circling back. He asked what made a bird fly, but also what made a leaf fall in a particular way. Why the moon reflected light. Why tears formed. Why mountains once rose from seas. Others in Rome pursued fame, climbed political ladders, secured commissions in cathedrals. Leonardo wrote in the margins. He was not bitter, only quiet. His few visitors noted his gentleness, his careful speech. His joy in small things, a flower on a walk, a musical phrase remembered, the clever sketch of a pupil. He had long since stopped trying to finish everything he started. He no longer chased completeness. Instead, he worked as the world worked. Slowly, naturally, without hurry. His mind remained restless, but no longer urgent. His days moved with rhythm. Mornings with sketches, afternoons with Melzi, or a walk through gardens, evenings with notes, or soft conversation, or silence. Rome, for all its splendor, had not embraced him fully, but it had given him time, and in that time he reached the edges of what he could know, not with frustration, but with awe. He once wrote that learning never exhausts the mind, and in those final Roman pages, the mind still wandered, still asked, still saw. Leonardo left Rome in 1516. He was in his mid-60s, his hair white, his hands slower, though his mind remained clear. His departure was quiet. No grand farewell, no ceremony. Just the steady gathering of belongings, sketchbooks, instruments, unfinished paintings, and a final look at the city that had held him at a distance. The invitation had come from France. King Francis. I admired him deeply. He saw not an old man, but a living treasure, a mind that had shaped the world and still shimmered with light. Leonardo accepted, perhaps knowing that this journey would be his last. He crossed the Alps slowly, wrapped in a warm cloak, his papers packed with care. The mountains rose around him, snow gathered in the folds of stone, and for a time, the path disappeared into silence. He traveled with Melzi, who had remained his closest companion. Other assistants came as well, loyal hands who carried not just supplies, but memory. They arrived in Amboise, in the Loire Valley, a gentle land of vineyards, rivers, and soft hills. The Château du Clos-Lucé, his new home, stood apart from the royal court, but within reach of its favor. It was quiet, with stone rooms, shaded gardens, and enough space for thought. There, Leonardo unpacked his world. He set up his studio near a tall window, where light entered softly in the morning and faded gently in the afternoon. He arranged his tools, opened his notebooks, and placed the Mona Lisa and a few other cherished paintings nearby. The king visited often, not with demands, but with curiosity. He listened as Leonardo explained ideas about water, about flight, about cities designed to breathe. They walked together in the gardens, two minds from different worlds, bound by shared wonder. Leonardo no longer worked on large commissions. He was no longer building machines or drafting grand scenes, but he still drew, still wrote. He reflected more now, his notes turning philosophical, poetic, quietly resigned. He thought about the nature of movement, of memory, of decay. He looked at the sky differently, not with the hunger of youth, but with the softness of farewell. France had given him something he had long sought. Not grandeur, not applause, but peace. And in the calm of the valley, among the trees and old stones, Leonardo began his final chapter. Not with a last work, but with a long breath, and time to take it. The rooms of Clos Lucé grew familiar, their stone walls warmed with afternoon sun. Their silence filled not with loneliness, but with thought. Leonardo rose each day without urgency. He moved through the house slowly, his steps deliberate, his mind still quietly reaching outward. He spent time with Melzi, the faithful pupil who had become like a son. Together, they organized drawings, sorted pages, copied notes. Melzi asked questions, and Leonardo answered with a patience that had deepened over the years. They spoke of nature, of light, of how water shaped the land, of how flight might someday become real. Leonardo had stopped trying to do everything, but he had not stopped imagining. In these final years, his notes were full of recollection. He wrote not only what he observed, but what he remembered. Sketches from his youth, thoughts from his long walks in Florence, diagrams of machines never built. He seemed to look back, not with regret, but with wonder at the path he had walked. He returned often to his earlier works. He studied the Mona Lisa, sometimes adding the lightest touch of paint, not to finish it, only to follow its breath a little further. He also kept drawing simple things: flowers, curls of hair, soft hills beneath clouds. He wrote poems in his notebooks, some just a few lines, reflections on time, on beauty, on the briefness of all things. He spoke rarely of death, but he prepared, not with fear, but with order. He arranged his writings, passed on notes to Melzi, and dictated wishes for how his work should be kept. His concern was not for himself, but for the thoughts he would leave behind. Visitors came. The king, still curious, would sit with him at times, listening. Leonardo would show a drawing, or explain a device, or speak of the human heart as both pump and metaphor. These visits were quiet, full of respect. He no longer sketched crowds or machines in motion. He drew rivers, handstory, a bird at rest. Each page felt like a goodbye whispered gently, almost without sound. And though his hands sometimes trembled, his lines stayed sure. He was not working toward a final masterpiece. He was breathing the last lines of a lifelong story. And each breath, each note, each sketch was a quiet echo of the boy from Vinci, still wondering why the birds fly, how the light bends, what it means to see clearly before the eyes finally close. The final days came gently. There was no sudden illness, no great announcement, only a slowing, as if time itself were easing him toward stillness. Leonardo remained in his room at Clos Lucé, where the light moved softly across the floor, tracing the hours in long, golden lines. Melzi was by his side, attentive and calm. So were a few trusted companions, those who had walked with him through the shifting cities and seasons of his long life. They did not crowd him. They simply stayed near, as he had always preferred, quietly present, like trees on the edge of a field. Leonardo spoke less, but when he did, his words were tender. He asked after the gardens, the sky, the flight of birds beyond the window. He gave final thoughts about unfinished ideas, machines that might still be built, pages yet to be bound, questions the world might someday answer. He asked for his notebooks, not to read or write, but simply to hold. They were part of him, more than records, more than plans. They were memories pressed into ink. He looked upon his paintings with the gaze of someone seeing old friends. The Mona Lisa stood nearby, quiet as ever, her smile unchanged. He rested his eyes on her face, not with pride, but with peace. The king sent gifts, flowers, and letters, words of deep respect. He understood what Leonardo had been, and what he still was. The morning of his passing was calm. The wind moved gently through the trees outside. Birds flew overhead, casting soft shadows on the walls. Leonardo closed his eyes, his breath slow, his hand resting on the cover of a worn notebook. He left no grand farewell, no dramatic last words, just the hush of departure, like a leaf falling, like a shadow passing. He was buried in Amboise, beneath the chapel walls, where stone meets earth and quiet endures. The world would take centuries to gather the full shape of what he left behind. Notes unread, sketches unseen, thoughts that still echo. But in that small room, with the morning light and the scent of ink and paper, Leonardo da Vinci left the world as he had lived within it, gently, curiously, completely.